Imagine you are one of the most lethal snipers on Earth. You have spent years mastering distance and angle and wind, and you have come to a city in western Iraq that is trying to kill you every single day. You have watched friends die on the rooftops around you. You have pulled triggers and counted the results with the cold precision that the laws of war demand. And then one morning, in the silence before Ramadi wakes up, you hear a different rifle. A weapon that belongs to a different category of violence entirely. You start counting. You reach 30, and then you stop. Not because the shooting has stopped, because 30 is a number that breaks something in professional warriors. Because no one in your chain of command has a doctrine for what you are watching. And because the men doing it will never be allowed to tell you their names. Before we go further, tell me in the comments which Special Forces unit you believe is the most lethal military instrument on Earth right now. Because what you are about to discover will challenge every answer you have ever considered. Stay until the end. The truth about what happened in Ramadi in 2006 has never been fully told. It is about to be. To understand the magnitude of what the United States military was facing in Al-Anbar governorate in the opening months of 2006, one must first reckon with a scale of failure that the Pentagon spent years trying to minimize in its official histories. The disaster was not the product of a single bad decision or a single incompetent commander. It was the predictable consequence of an entire philosophy of warfare colliding with an enemy that had studied that philosophy with precision, identified its fatal dependency, and built a city-wide system to exploit it. What happened in Ramadi would expose a truth that powerful institutions with significant pride, investment in their own doctrine, are almost physically incapable of hearing, that the most expensive, most technologically sophisticated military apparatus in human history could be neutralized, neighborhood by neighborhood, by an enemy with no air force, no tanks, and no budget that anyone in Washington would have considered serious. Al-Anbar governorate covers roughly a third of Iraq's entire landmass. It is a vast, largely desert province, with the Euphrates River cutting through its populated heart. And at the center of that heart sits Ramadi, a city of approximately 500,000 people located 110 kilometers west of Baghdad, the capital of a province that any serious military strategist understood immediately was the insurgency's main artery. Every foreign fighter crossing from Syria, every weapon shipment moving east toward the capital, every dollar funding the car bomb networks, every Al-Qaeda in Iraq planner moving between safe houses in the Euphrates River Valley. All of it flowed through Al-Anbar, and the city that controlled Al-Anbar was Ramadi. Al-Qaeda in Iraq understood this with a clarity that American planners were still debating in conference rooms when the enemy was already acting on it. They did not merely establish a presence in Ramadi, they declared it the formal capital of the Islamic State of Iraq. They put up signs, they held court. They governed by terror in the open streets of a provincial capital, while American forces watched from bases on the city's perimeter and tried to understand what they were facing. The American approach rested on several assumptions that had worked in every previous theater. You established bases. You conducted patrols. When insurgents engaged you, you called in firepower and eliminated the contact. Then you returned to base. The logic was militarily sound in the abstract. What it produced in Ramadi was a city that Al-Qaeda in Iraq could use freely the moment any patrol turned back toward the wire. The neighborhoods that American forces cleared in battalion-sized sweeps would be reoccupied within days, because there was no persistent presence to hold what had been taken. The insurgents had learned to read American patrol patterns with an accuracy that bordered on academic. They knew the timing of rotations, the standard reaction to contact, the minimum distance from base before calling for support. The doctrine had become a predictable script, and the enemy had memorized every line. On January 5, 2006, Al-Qaeda in Iraq demonstrated that they were not merely adapting to American strategy. They were executing a deliberate campaign of institutional decapitation. On that morning, a suicide bomb detonated at a gathering of Iraqi police recruits, killing 56 men in a single explosion, an entire cohort of the security force that American commanders had spent 2 years trying to build, eliminated before any of them had completed a single day of actual training. Within days, Al-Qaeda in Iraq assassinated half of the tribal leaders of the Anbar People's Committee, the political infrastructure through which any grassroots resistance to their control would have had to flow. In a single week, the enemy had destroyed both the security and the political architecture of American strategy in western Iraq. The classified intelligence assessments that circulated within the Marine Expeditionary Force and reached the desks of general officers in Baghdad were devastating in their frankness. The province might be lost. The city was almost certainly lost. By the spring of 2006, the physical reality of Ramadi confirmed what the assessments had predicted. There was no electricity, no running water, no garbage collection, no phone service. Raw sewage ran in the streets where the pipes had been shattered by 2 years of fighting. The markets were shuttered. The schools were closed. The 400,000 residents who had not yet fled were locked inside their homes, venturing out only under urgent necessity, because the streets of Ramadi were a place where a man could be killed for walking in the wrong direction at the wrong hour. Time magazine would eventually describe it as the most dangerous city in Iraq. Even that assessment may have underestimated the situation. A soldier who left his barracks on Camp Corregidor, the main coalition base in eastern Ramadi, without full combat kit, even to reach a portable toilet 25 meters away, was not being careless. He was being suicidal. The mortaring happened on average 3 times a day. The sniper fire happened without pattern or warning, which was its own kind of pattern, because unpredictability had become the only predictable thing in Ramadi, and the soldiers and Marines who lived there had adapted their psychology to a baseline of sustained threat that their families back home could not have comprehended. It was into this condition, this city that had effectively fallen before the main battle for it had officially begun, that the United States Army sent a colonel named Sean Barry McFarland in June of 2006. McFarland, born February 12, 1959, had a lanky frame, a boyish face, and a soft voice that concealed an iron determination to do something his superior officers privately believed was impossible. He had watched a reformer named H.R. McMaster run a different kind of counterinsurgency in Tal Afar the year before, and what he had seen had convinced him that the standard approach, the large bases, the patrol and return cycle, the assumption that firepower could substitute for presence, was not a strategy. It was a holding pattern. McFarland arrived in Ramadi with a plan that would later be described by military historians as a breakthrough, and was described by the generals above him at the time as reckless. He would not operate from the perimeter of the city. He would push small fortified positions, combat outposts, into the most dangerous neighborhoods in Ramadi. He would live inside the enemy's operational space rather than raiding it from the outside. He would make the city's population the object of the strategy rather than an obstacle to it. He would call what he was doing, with the quiet confidence of a man who has checked his mathematics twice, a 3-dimensional game of chess. At roughly the same time McFarland was assuming command, the man who would become the most publicly famous American soldier of that battle was arriving with his unit at Camp Corregidor. Christopher Scott Kyle, born April 8, 1974, in Odessa, Texas, was a Navy SEAL sniper assigned to SEAL Team 3's task unit Bruiser, a unit commanded by Lieutenant Commander Jocko Willink, and a unit that would, by the end of its deployment, become the most highly decorated special operations unit of the entire Iraq War. Kyle had served in Iraq before. He had already built a record that his peers described with the particular respect that military men reserve for skills they understand too well to exaggerate. He came to Ramadi for his third tour, and what he accomplished there between April and August of 2006 is documented not in rumor, but in a formal Silver Star citation that states, with the flat precision of military bureaucracy, that during 32 sniper overwatch missions, he personally accounted for 91 confirmed enemy fighters killed, and dozens more probably killed or wounded. 91 confirmed kills. 32 missions. That is nearly 3 per mission in a sustained operational tempo that would have been remarkable for any sniper in any war. In Ramadi in 2006, it was one part of one unit's contribution to one battle. Willink himself, born September 8, 1971, had gone through basic underwater demolition and SEAL training with Class 177, spent 8 years as an enlisted operator before earning his commission, and arrived in Ramadi with a philosophy of command that would later become the foundation of best-selling books and a global consulting practice. He called it extreme ownership. The principle held that a commander bears complete responsibility for everything that happens within his area of operations. No exceptions, no excuses, no redistribution of accountability downward to subordinates or upward to circumstances. It sounds straightforward stated in that form. It is extraordinarily difficult to practice in conditions where the situation changes by the hour and the margin for error is measured in human lives. Task Unit Bruiser's ranks included Mark Allen Lee, a young SEAL from Hood River, Oregon, who had failed selection on his first attempt and gone back a second time and graduated second in his class. Michael Anthony Mansour from Long Beach, California, a machine gunner and communicator who carried 100 pounds of kit in temperatures that regularly exceeded 100 degrees and never gave his teammates any indication that the weight exceeded what he had anticipated. Ryan Jubb, whom his teammates called Biggles. Kevin Lax, a medic and sniper who would later describe what he witnessed in Ramadi with a precision and honesty that most people who have never been to war find difficult to process. These men were not operating as a standalone force. They were embedded within McFarland's conventional brigade, providing the capabilities that Navy SEALs bring to an integrated force. Reconnaissance, raids against high-value targets, sniper overwatch for the combat outpost establishment operations that were McFarland's core instrument, and the training and advising of Iraqi security forces that the entire strategy depended on eventually standing independently. The overwatch missions were the most technically demanding and the most psychologically exhausting. Every time McFarland's engineers went to build a new combat outpost inside insurgent territory, and every single establishment was conducted under fire or the immediate threat of it, SEAL sniper teams had to infiltrate surrounding buildings before dawn, establish firing positions on rooftops and in upper-story windows, and hold those positions against counterattacks while construction happened below and around them. They were not merely snipers in a traditional sense. They were the linchpin of an operational system that would not have functioned without them, and they were doing this while being hunted by an enemy that had its own snipers, documented, organized, and effective. Men who had mapped the location of every coalition sniper hide in the city with the same patience that the Americans were using to map theirs. Operating in parallel with Task Unit Bruiser, connected through a command network that most Americans did not know existed, was a unit that had been formally invisible since a British newspaper had accidentally revealed its original designation during an unrelated incident in Basra the year before. Task Force Night, formerly Task Force Black, was the British Special Forces element of the Joint Special Operations Command's integrated network in Iraq. Its core was a Sabre squadron of the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, the SAS, the unit that David Sterling had conceived in North Africa in 1941, built on the principle that small teams of rigorously trained men operating beyond the reach of conventional support could accomplish things that entire armies could not. The unit that had spent 6 decades refining that principle through Malaya, Oman, Northern Ireland, the Falklands, and the Gulf War, and had now arrived in Iraq, formally integrated into the Joint Special Operations Command under an operation called Traction, completed in mid-January of 2006. The integration was not ceremonial. From the moment Operation Traction concluded, the SAS were sharing targeting intelligence with Delta Force and the Naval Special Warfare Development Group in real time, running kill-capture operations against Al-Qaeda in Iraq's mid-level leadership in coordination with the entire Joint Special Operations Command network, and accumulating a body of operational knowledge about the human terrain of the insurgency that no amount of American firepower could have substituted for. Their headquarters was in Baghdad, but Al-Qaeda in Iraq's leadership was concentrated in Ramadi, and the SAS went where the intelligence said the enemy was. What the Americans had not fully absorbed about the British approach, and what the SEALs of Task Unit Bruiser were about to discover in a manner that none of them would detail in any official document, was that the SAS operated according to a philosophy of urban precision warfare that diverged from American special operations thinking at a critical point. Not in the fundamentals of marksmanship, not in the fundamentals of small unit tactics. The divergence was in a single word: patience. American Special Operations Forces in Ramadi were operating at a tempo that was, in the context of that battle, genuinely extraordinary. Task Unit Bruiser would eventually conduct approximately 65 direct-action combat operations during their deployment at a pace that left individual operators sleeping in 4-hour increments on a good night. The system was built on speed. Get in, accomplish the objective, get out before the enemy can react. The SAS approached the same urban battlefield as if speed were a liability. The longer you moved, the more noise you made. The more noise you made, the more you announced your position to an enemy that had turned the entire population of a city into an intelligence apparatus. What the British understood, at a level so deep it had become organizational instinct, was that in a city like Ramadi, where every resident was either terrified into silence by Al-Qaeda in Iraq or actively working for them, where the enemy knew the timing and pattern of coalition operations with an accuracy that suggested deep and reliable information, the most powerful tactical position was stillness. You did not hunt. You established yourself, you waited, and you let the enemy come to a position he did not know you occupied. The weapon the SAS brought to this philosophy was not a standard sniper rifle in the conventional military definition. The Barrett rifle, designated the Lima 82 Alpha 1 in British service, is a semi-automatic anti-materiel weapon chambered for the .50 caliber Browning machine gun round, a projectile of such mass and velocity that it was designed not to kill soldiers, but to destroy light vehicles, disable aircraft on runways, and penetrate armor that conventional rifle rounds cannot touch. In the American military's framework, this class of weapon was not considered appropriate for engagement of individual personnel. In the SAS's operational framework, that distinction ignored what the weapon actually did at ranges that American doctrine had not trained for. An SAS sniper with a Barrett at 1,000 meters could do something that no conventional rifle system could accomplish: engage a target through intermediate cover, not around a wall, not over it, through it. An Al-Qaeda in Iraq commander who believed himself safely positioned inside a fortified building, protected by the solid masonry construction of an Iraqi city, was protected from everything except a half-inch diameter projectile arriving at supersonic velocity from a position he had not identified and could not locate in time. This was the capability that the intelligence picture in Ramadi in the autumn of 2006 made operationally necessary. The Al-Qaeda in Iraq network that Task Force Knight had been tracking through the Joint Special Operations Command's fused intelligence system was not a loose collection of fighters operating independently. It was an organized command structure using a cluster of buildings in one sector of the city as a coordinated network of firing positions, communication nodes, and planning facilities. The fighters in that cluster had spent 2 years learning exactly which buildings were safe from conventional sniper engagement. They had mapped the range limitations of American weapons systems. They had built their positions around those limitations with the competence of men who had studied their enemy as carefully as their enemy had studied them. The geometry of the sector meant that SEAL sniper teams operating with standard weapons could not achieve the angles necessary to engage the network's command positions without compromising their own positions first. Task Force Knight's intelligence package, built from signals intercepts, fused with human sources, and months of surveillance data, had mapped exactly what was there and exactly what it would take to dismantle it. The operation was communicated to Task Unit Bruiser through the integrated network with the sparse, economical language that elite units use when planning something with significant risk attached. A British team would be operating in a sector adjacent to the American overwatch area. The Americans would hold their positions and provide coverage of the approach routes. Radio traffic would be kept to essential communications only. The British team would infiltrate to their position under cover of darkness and establish their hide before dawn. The Americans, from their overwatch, would monitor the shared radio frequency and observe the adjacent sector through their own optics. What they would not see was the British position. The SAS's infiltration route and precise location were not shared, for exactly the same reasons that no professional sniper ever shares his exact position with anyone who does not need to know it. Before that morning came, the unit receiving the briefing had already buried one man and was watching another recover from wounds that would leave him permanently blind. Mark Allen Lee was 28 years old when he died. He had failed his first attempt at selection and gone back because the quality that distinguished him was not natural aptitude, but a refusal to accept the first answer as the final one. He graduated second in his class on the second attempt. He deployed to Ramadi with Charlie Platoon in May of 2006. On the night of August 2nd, during a cordon and search operation in the heavily contested neighborhood known as J Block, his teammate Ryan Job was struck in the face by an enemy sniper round and critically wounded. Lee stepped into the position where Job had just been shot, the most exposed angle on that rooftop, the one the enemy sniper was still covering, and laid down suppressive fire while his teammates moved Job to safety. The city killed him for it. He was posthumously awarded the Silver Star. Ryan Job survived, but spent the rest of his life without his sight. Job died in September of 2009 from a preventable error during surgery, while his wife was pregnant with their first child. Michael Anthony Mansour had a different kind of courage from the kind that motivates most people. Not the courage of calculation, of weighing risk against outcome and deciding the outcome justifies the cost. The courage of the instant. On September 29, 2006, a grenade landed on a rooftop where Mansour, 3 fellow SEAL snipers, and 3 Iraqi army soldiers were positioned. His body was between the grenade and the only clear escape route. He was the only man with a path. He yelled grenade and fell on it. He died 30 minutes later. He was 25 years old. President George W. Bush presented the Medal of Honor to his parents on April 8, 2008. A Zumwalt-class guided missile destroyer bears his name and is at sea today. It was days after Mansour's death, with the unit still carrying the weight of it, that Task Force Knight sent their team to the adjacent sector. The SEAL operators who held overwatch that night knew they were working in proximity to the British element. They didn't know what they were about to witness. There is no briefing format that communicates the experience of watching something that your entire professional training has told you sits at the outer boundary of what is achievable. There is no doctrine that prepares you for the moment when reality corrects a theory you did not know you held. Ramadi in the pre-dawn is cold in a way that surprises people who have only thought of Iraq as hot. The desert night in the Euphrates River Valley drops the temperature to a point where a man lying still on a concrete rooftop feels the cold working into his joints and his concentration in a way that requires active management. The city in those hours makes sounds different from its daytime sounds. The dogs that roam the empty streets, a distant generator, the particular quality of silence that a city produces when the human population that normally fills it with noise has retreated indoors and stopped moving. The SEALs in their overwatch positions had been in this silence long enough to have mapped it, to know which sounds belonged to the background and which ones carried information. The sound of a .50 caliber anti-materiel rifle at approximately a kilometer's distance is not what most people imagine when they imagine a sniper shot. It is not a crack. It is something lower, more physical, a concussive quality you feel in the chest before you process it as sound. The SEAL radio operator monitoring the shared frequency heard the first shot and registered it without immediate reaction because the registration was fast and instinctive. Large caliber weapon, adjacent sector, on schedule. He noted the time. He did not yet start counting. The second shot came at an interval that was not the interval of a man adjusting his position, clearing a jam, or recalibrating after an unexpected result. It was the interval of a man who had assessed his first shot, confirmed its outcome, identified his next target, and fired with the unhurried deliberation of someone who is not being rushed by anything, because he has established a hide the enemy does not know about and cannot find. The third shot came at roughly the same interval, then the fourth. The SEAL radio operator, whose training had conditioned him to track exactly this kind of data, began to count. At 7, one of the other SEALs in the position had shifted from monitoring his own sector to studying the target area through his optics, not to find the British position, which was not visible from their angle, but to observe what was happening in the buildings they were covering. What he was seeing required a moment of recalibration that experienced operators do not normally need. The shots were arriving from a point in the city that American doctrine had categorized as an intermediate cover zone, rather than a viable hide at that distance. The distinction, in the pre-dawn light of a Ramadi autumn morning, was no longer a doctrinal abstraction. It was the difference between what the SEALs knew how to do and what they were watching happen in real time. At 15, the radio traffic from the SEAL position to their tactical operations center dropped to essential communications only. This was not a protocol decision. It was the instinctive response of men who are witnessing something that demands their complete attention, and who understand, at a level below conscious thought, that speaking at this moment would be a kind of intrusion. The Tactical Operations Center commander noted the reduction in traffic. He did not immediately understand what it signified. At 20, the sector the British team was addressing had gone quiet in a way that experienced urban warfare operators recognize. Not the quiet of an empty space, but the quiet of a space from which organized human activity has been removed. The Al-Qaeda in Iraq communication patterns in that sector, which the Joint Special Operations Command's signals intelligence had been monitoring through the operation, showed a disruption unlike the pattern of units going to ground in response to contact. A command structure was losing the nodes through which its communications flowed. The network wasn't retreating. It was being dismantled, position by position, with a rhythm as deliberate as the shots themselves. At 30, something happened among the SEAL Overwatch team that the men who were there have never described in any official document, and have described privately only in the oblique language that warriors use when discussing something that does not fit the vocabulary of their training. One of them stopped counting, not as a decision, as a recognition. 30 confirmed engagements from a single position, at ranges that American doctrine classified as the outer margins of practical sniping, through cover that should have made those engagements impossible, in a sustained operation that had produced zero counter-fire, because the British position had not been identified and could not be identified by an enemy that did not know what could reach them from where the team was sitting. This was not a number that fit within any framework the word sniper was supposed to contain. 30 was a number that belonged to a different category of military capability entirely, one that the United States Army had no doctrine for, had not trained toward, and had not understood that it was missing. The British team extracted as morning light increased, and the window for undetected movement began to close. They moved through the adjacent sector with the same unhurried deliberation that had characterized the operation from its beginning. The SEAL overwatch covered their withdrawal, a professional courtesy that also served the practical purpose of ensuring no counterattack followed their route. The British team passed through without incident. They did not pause at the American position. They did not debrief on the ground. They continued on their route. What they left behind in the sector they had operated in was a silence that would last 11 days before the first attack from that network was attempted again, because there was no longer a network sufficiently intact to coordinate one. The SEAL Tactical Operations Center commander, receiving his elements' report upon their return to base, asked a question that hadn't been part of any standard after-action format before that morning. He asked how many shots the British team had fired. The answer that came back, "We stopped counting at 30, became the phrase that circulated through Task Unit Bruiser in the hours after, with the quality of information that changes how people think, rather than simply adding to what they know. Kyle heard it. Willink heard it. Every member of the unit heard it. And the response was not competitive or defensive, because these were men who understood precisely what the number meant. The response was the particular silence of warriors reassessing a framework they had considered complete. While the British team had been dismantling a command network in one sector, something was occurring across the rest of Ramadi that would eventually be understood as the political earthquake that ended Al-Qaeda in Iraq's occupation, but that in the autumn of 2006 appeared to be nothing more than a series of localized decisions by tribal leaders who had finally been pushed past a threshold the enemy had been approaching for months without understanding the danger. On August 21, 2006, an Al-Qaeda in Iraq execution squad killed Sheikh Abu Ali Jassim, a Sunni tribal leader who had been encouraging his tribesmen to join the Iraqi police. Jassim was not the first pro-coalition tribal figure to be assassinated, but this time, the execution team committed an act so contemptuous of the cultural world within which the Iraqi tribal structure operated that it accomplished something 18 months of American diplomatic effort had failed to produce. They hid the body in a field. They refused to return it for burial. In the Sunni tribal world of Western Iraq, there is no desecration more absolute than the denial of proper Islamic burial rites. It is not an insult to a family. It is a declaration that the dead man was not entitled to the basic dignity that Islam requires for every human being. 40 sheikhs from 20 tribes across Al-Anbar organized the Sahwa Al-Anbar, the Anbar Awakening, within days of Jassim's murder. Al-Qaeda in Iraq had handed the Americans the political breakthrough that years of strategic effort had failed to secure because their contempt for the population they were trying to govern had finally exceeded that population's capacity to absorb it. The instrument through whom that political breakthrough was translated into an actual alliance was a man who defied easy categorization. Sheikh Abdul Sattar Abu Risha was a minor tribal leader from the Albu Risha tribe near Ramadi, a known smuggler who carried a large revolver on his hip. He was not the most prestigious figure in the Anbar tribal hierarchy. What he was watching. He had been watching McFarland's brigade fight Al-Qaeda in Iraq toe-to-toe for months, suffering casualties, holding ground, and keeping every commitment they made to the tribal leaders they met with. Other Americans had made promises. Other Americans had withdrawn. McFarland was still there, and the outposts his engineers had built under fire were still standing. Sattar approached McFarland and offered an alliance. McFarland accepted without hesitation. On September 14, 2006, at a formal tribal council attended by more than 50 sheikhs, Sattar declared the Anbar Awakening officially underway. By October, nearly every tribe in northern and western Ramadi had joined it. The man who made that political revolution comprehensible to the tribal leaders in human terms, who translated the abstract American offer of partnership into the personal, credible language the sheikhs needed to hear, was an army captain named Travis Patrican. Patriquin had a gift for Arabic that most American officers did not possess, and an understanding of tribal culture that no formal training program had given him. He spent his days in Ramadi drinking tea with men who had reason to distrust him, listening before he spoke, and making commitments he then kept with a scrupulousness that the sheikhs found remarkable in an American officer. McFarland would later say that Patrican was a more very good reason for the sheikhs to trust Americans, because the sheikhs trusted him personally, and his presence made the American commitment feel human rather than institutional. On December 6, 2006, Patrican was killed when an improvised explosive device detonated beneath the Humvee in which he was traveling. The sheikhs who attended his memorial service wept openly. They named a police station after him. He was 32 years old. What the SAS operation had accomplished was not merely the elimination of a counted number of fighters from a mapped area. In the larger strategic picture becoming visible by late autumn of 2006, it was something more structurally significant. The command infrastructure that Task Force Knight had dismantled had been coordinating the operations, targeted assassinations of tribal leaders sympathetic to the awakening, bombings of police recruits, harassment of civilians who cooperated with coalition forces, that Al-Qaeda in Iraq needed to suppress the political revolution beginning in the streets around them. Remove the capacity for those operations, and the political revolution has room to breathe. This is not how the operation was briefed. Tactical operations do not present themselves with strategic self-awareness at the moment of execution. But in retrospect, the sequencing was unmistakable. The awakening accelerated in direct proportion to the degradation of the networks that had been suppressing it. The cost of everything accomplished in Ramadi is a number that Colonel McFarland stated without embellishment at the formal ceremony, marking his brigade's handover of responsibility. 86 soldiers, sailors, and Marines. 8 months of the most intense urban combat American forces had experienced since Vietnam, paid for in 86 lives. The SAS paid a cost that has never been tallied publicly. 6 men killed, 30 wounded. Their names are classified. Their families signed agreements before deployment that prevent them from discussing what their loved ones died doing, or where, or to what purpose. The British government has never held a ceremony acknowledging the named dead of Task Force Knight in the way American military culture permits and encourages the public acknowledgement of sacrifice. This is not bureaucratic oversight. It is the permanent condition of serving in an organization that officially does not exist, in wars that are not officially acknowledged until years after the fact. 6 men are dead, and the people who loved them cannot fully say how or why or where. The institutional response of the American military to what Task Force Knight had demonstrated followed a pattern that anyone who has studied how large organizations process inconvenient information will recognize immediately. The results were noted. The contribution of the British element was logged through the Joint Special Operations Command's accounting and filed in reports carrying classification levels that ensured they would not reach anyone positioned to ask uncomfortable doctrinal questions. The capability the SAS had demonstrated generated no formal review of training programs or tactical manuals. The lesson was filed in the same institutional archive where every military truth that requires an existing doctrine to be questioned eventually ends up. Acknowledged by the people who were present, inaccessible to the people positioned to act on it. What happened at the level of individual human transmission was different, because this is how military knowledge actually travels when institutions are not attending to it. SEAL operators and Rangers and other American Special Operations personnel who had worked alongside SAS teams in Ramadi and other theaters carried back to their training programs and informal mentorship networks. Frameworks about patience and distance and the geometry of urban positions. The knowledge moved the way genuine knowledge moves in closed communities. Through the memories of men who were there, through adjustments that individual trainers make to programs based on what they have personally witnessed. It did not appear in doctrine. It appeared in the next generation of operators. General David Petraeus arrived in Iraq in February of 2007 and flew to Ramadi first. He wanted to see what McFarland had built, because what McFarland had built was the proof of concept he was about to scale across the entire country under what the world would call the surge. He saw the combat outposts. He saw the tribal engagement architecture. He saw the integrated special operations network that had made the whole system function with a precision that conventional forces alone could not have achieved. In August of 2008, in an interview with the Times of London, Petraeus said of the SAS that they had helped immensely in Iraq, in particular to take down the Al-Qaeda car bomb networks. That was the closest the American military establishment ever came, publicly, to acknowledging what Task Force Night had contributed to the war. It was published in a British newspaper. It generated almost no coverage in the United States. The bombings across Iraq had dropped from approximately 150 per month to approximately 2. The men responsible for a significant portion of that reduction cannot tell you their names. By August of 2007, the city of Ramadi had gone 80 consecutive days without a single attack on United States forces. 80 days, in a city that had been considered irretrievably lost 14 months earlier. Children were playing in streets that had been killing grounds. The government center that Marines had defended under constant fire for 2 years was functioning as a government center again. The Iraqi police force that Al-Qaeda in Iraq had tried to destroy in a single devastating bombing on January 5, 2006, had been rebuilt, retrained, and was operating independently. The province of Al-Anbar was transferred to Iraqi government control on September 1, 2008, the first province in Iraq to complete that transition. The chess game McFarland had described was over. 9 years after those 80 consecutive quiet days, in January of 2016, a British SAS soldier who was part of a team advising Iraqi forces in the same city of Ramadi made a decision. Islamic State fighters, the ideological successors, and in many cases the direct organizational descendants of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, had positioned themselves on the top floor of a building that also housed civilians on the lower floors. An airstrike was proposed and rejected. Artillery was proposed and rejected. The SAS staff sergeant in charge of the team proposed shooting through the wall. A sniper positioned himself 1 kilometer away from the building and fired 30 armor-piercing rounds from a .50 caliber Barrett through the masonry of an Islamic State command post eliminating the fighters while leaving the civilians on the lower floors, alive and unharmed. British press accounts noted it was the first time British troops were known to have taken part in a direct ground attack against the Islamic State. American observers, who were briefed on the outcome, recognized it with the recognition that professionals feel when something confirms what they have always believed but could not previously document. The same doctrine, from the same regiment, in the same city, a decade after the lesson had first been taught and filed away. Nothing had changed about the approach. It had simply been correct from the beginning. Today, when you see elite military units from across the NATO alliance conducting training for what the doctrinal literature describes as extended precision engagement in complex urban environments, when you see special operations forces in programs that emphasize stillness over movement, position geometry over tempo, and maximum effective range as an offensive tool rather than a technical limitation, you are seeing the inheritance of what happened on a Ramadi rooftop in 2006. The origin of the lesson is not cited in any training manual you can read. The operation is not commemorated anywhere. There is no memorial to what the British team accomplished. There is only the accomplishment itself, absorbed into the bloodstream of modern warfare, the way all genuine military learning absorbs. Permanently, and without the acknowledgement that the people who paid for it deserved. The official history of the Battle of Ramadi preserves what it can preserve. Kyle's 91 confirmed kills, Willink's ownership, Mansour's Medal of Honor, Lee's Silver Star, the awakening that a tribal leader and an army colonel built from an alliance forged in a city that was trying to kill them both. These are genuine stories of genuine courage, and the books and films they have generated have given American culture a way to understand what was accomplished there. The story those accounts cannot tell, because the men who lived it cannot write memoirs, and the families of the men who died in it have signed away the right to speak, is the other half. 6 names that are classified. An operational contribution that one American general acknowledged in a British newspaper that almost no American read. A doctrine of precision that changed how wars are fought, and that has never been officially attributed to the morning that proved it. What the official record counts is what can be counted. It was the SEALs of Task Unit Bruiser who understood, on one morning in Ramadi in 2006, that some things worth knowing will never appear in any official record at all. They stopped counting at 30 because 30 was the number at which men trained to track exactly this kind of data, understood that what they were witnessing did not belong to the category of things that counting could contain. They were not admitting limitation. They were bearing witness to a standard that their training, their doctrine, and their institution had not prepared them to meet. And bearing witness is not the same as defeat. It is the beginning of learning. The men who set that standard crossed an ocean to fight in a war their country has never formally acknowledged. They built their hides in darkness and held still through the coldest hours of a Ramadi night without moving or speaking, because stillness was more powerful than motion in that city on that morning. And then they fired with a steadiness and accuracy that made the most decorated SEAL task unit in American military history go quiet on their radios. Those men will never read this. Their government will never confirm it. But you know it now. You know what 30 means. You know what it costs when the people who purchased the most important lesson of a war are the last people who will ever be given credit for teaching it. Now you do.